Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain.
Do we know who wrote the Bible?
Yes!
Who wrote Mark? Who wrote Matthew? Who wrote Luke? Who wrote John? Why is it such a problem?
As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels, as they've come down to us, is that they were anonymous, and we don't know their names, and they're not built on eyewitness testimony.
That's right.
Did these authors know Jesus?
Yes, they did.
Did they live with Jesus? Did they hear what he had to say? Therefore, they are eyewitnesses, are they not? At least two of them are.
When we look at the Gospels, who wrote these Gospels? Tom Wright says we don't know who wrote them. The Gospel according to John, you said, goes back to testimony from early disciples of John. But in fact, Raymond Brown, who is a world scholar in the Gospel according to John, tells us that this went through 5 stages of editing, and 3 different persons worked on it over time: the original composer and the later redactor. So too with the other Gospels. We don't know who was the Mark who wrote this, even though Papias said so. But today scholars say this is an anonymous Gospel. There were many Marks going around. We don't know which one, and even if it is Mark. And as for Matthew, they said that Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, but today historians generally say that Matthew was not a disciple of Jesus because he depended on Mark, who was not a disciple.
Okay. The Gospels of the New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and in fact they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the Gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. The Gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the Gospel writers themselves sometimes change the stories. That's why there are discrepancies.
That's right.
Don't be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it, not run from it.